Hi there, welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh. This is Gizmo and Widget, my travelling companions. And welcome back to our series, Hidden Gems in the Cotswolds. We're travelling on your behalf through the centre of the Cotswolds, seeking out smaller places you might easily not come across, little villages, churches, even the occasional artefact. Come with us and let's go and find some wonderful Cotswold gems. And most of all, welcome to episode 7 of Hidden Gems in the Cotswolds. You find us today in the little village of North Cerny. I hope I've pronounced that right. I've no doubt someone will tell me if I haven't. This has come as a surprise to us, this place, because we don't know all there is to know about the Cotswolds. But it is astonishing. This church is a real find. Even Pevsner, who is not prone to doing that kind of thing, suggests that this might be one of the best preserved churches in the whole of the Cotswolds. It's a magical place, and we're going to show you around. Come with me. What Pevsner actually says about the church is this: All Saints in North Cerny is, for many, the most attractive of all Cotswold village churches. Largely thanks to William Iveson Croom of Cerny House, who lived between 1891 and 1967, and whose benefactions from 1913 onwards filled the church with exquisite furnishings. These were mostly designed by F.C. Eden, and are amongst his finest work. Frederick Charles Eden was an architect and a stained glass designer. He was born in Hove in Sussex in 1864. He worked on several church restorations, adding Anglo-Catholic interior embellishments, his earliest being at St. Protus and St. Hyacinth at Blisland in Cornwall, followed by the interiors of Holy Trinity Church in Eltham in Kent, and this one, All Saints Church, North Cerny. He was a leading authority on chancel screens in England and Wales. The basic structure of this building is 12th century, but signs of an earlier church were found here in 1912 during maintenance work. We know that after a fire in 1460, a major rebuilding took place, and towards the end of the 19th century, the much-favoured firm of Waller and Son, whom we've come across so many times in this area, restored the church again, adding the organ chamber. When we arrived here, we had a moment of disappointment when we discovered the porch door was locked, but fortunately we noticed a little sign on the wall, directing us to the tower doorway. This was indeed open, and we entered the church through a tiny, narrow door into an informal and friendly room from which a worn and pretty stone spiral staircase led upwards to a locked door, probably the bell-ringer's loft. This was a really good start. I love spiral stone stairs, even, as is usual, when they're closed to intruders like me. This room brought us through to the body of the church from the west end, under cover of a very deep first-floor gallery, whose access is from an outside flight of steps next to the porch. This was locked, but understandably so. Up to this stage, all the fun of the building had been architectural, and it didn't stop there. On each side of the chancel arch there is a squint. I really love these brilliant solutions to the fact that parishioners in the side chapels like to see what's going on in the nave. The north squint is just at eye level, but the southern one is a passage squint, through which I got a great deal of childish pleasure walking. Most wonderfully, though, from this passage rose another stone spiral, which, when climbed, led to a rood loft, from which vantage point we got a unique perspective on this great church. And it's from here that we got a truly clear idea of the amazing contents for which this church is famous. The late 15th century octagonal font, the amazing pulpit, perhaps the finest in the Cotswolds from about 1480, the bowl of which is made from a single piece of stone, and the elaborate carving is reminiscent of the door above the altar in Magdalen College Chapel, which we know to have been made by a Burford mason. Surely this was made by the same hand. The lectern, which came from the marine stores in Gloucester Dock, has a 15th century Flemish eagle and a Spanish steel stand of about the same time. The reading desk was made in 1929 from 16th and 17th century remnants. The main altar is made from the original medieval stone altar, which was discovered beneath the Lady Chapel floor, restored and re-erected in 1913. On the loft itself is an amazing Italian rood figure of Christ's crucifixion from around 1600. To be honest, I could go on for hours, but I think maybe this isn't the moment for that. Perhaps we will revisit this church one day and do a comprehensive piece for the benefit of those of you who will never be in a position to visit yourselves. But meanwhile, I suggest any of you who can should really try and come here and see for yourselves. We, however, thought we would have a glance at the house in which the benefactor of this church had lived, and to our extremely pleasant surprise, we discovered its gardens were open to the public. We couldn't resist and went in to have a look. What a treat! The house just above the church is surrounded by a bowl of hillside and a wonderful walled garden, along with woodland walks, a ruined chapel, an ancient ice house, make it one of the most gently peaceful places to visit I've seen in a while. We met locals in the garden who told us it had been a saviour for them during the hellish lockdowns of the last few years, and I certainly felt infinitely more relaxed after our visit. I have a feeling we met one of the family who owned the house, although she didn't say so. We asked around to see if it was okay to film and met a charming lady stocking up the food in the cafe. Somehow her confident attitude and friendly response suggested proprietorship. If so, she was a descendant, either directly or by marriage, of Sir Michael and Lady Angus, who bought the place in 1983. He was a highly influential man of business, and warrants a Google search. For the measly sum of £6, paid for in an honesty box by the potting shed, a wander through these gardens will take you back to the life of an English aristocrat of the early 20th century and earlier. It's absolutely wonderful. Just when you think this little village can't offer any more, you discover on exiting the road from behind the church that there is a pub opposite called the Bathurst Arms. Irresistible for us, to be honest. So for 2 days running we stopped here for lunch and were treated to simple but delicious bar snacks and great local beer served to us by extremely friendly and helpful staff who were clearly enjoying their work. I'm sure that in the high summer, when tourism is in full flight, this place will be extremely busy, but my guess is that they will handle it well, and it will be enjoyable at any time. It certainly was on these days in May 2023. I do hope you've enjoyed our little trip around North Cerny. It's been quite remarkable to be taken by surprise by this place. We've loved it. Following our delicious lunch in North Cerny, we're heading now for Sapperton, which is north of here, about 7 miles. It takes about 15 minutes. It's a beautiful spring day. The sun is shining. We're really looking forward to going round this little village. It has a fabulous church, about which Evans writes in some detail, and I will read to you what he has to say shortly. But this is also the western end of the great canal that burrowed under the hills here to join the Severn and the Thames, and we're going to see if we can find the entrance to that canal. Come with me, we're going to show you around. The church claims our first attention. Though, with the exception of the tower, it dates only from the early 18th century, it is a building of exceptional interest. To enter is to be transported in a twinkling back to the days of good Queen Anne. Instinctively, you look around for the rector in gown and bands, the musicians with bass viol and hautboy in the gallery, and Sir Robert in laced coat and flowing periwig, seated at his ease in the squire's pew. Sir Robert, do I say? The Gloucestershire man, versed in the history of the Atkins family, will of course remind me that there were two Sir Roberts, father and son, and that as the son survived the father only a couple of years, the chances are that they frequented the family pew together. And well they may, for the father resided at the Manor house quite close to the church, the son at Pinbury, only a mile higher up the valley. The Atkinsons were a family of lawyers, and for generations there had always been a judge in the family. Sir Robert, the elder, was Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer, and purchased Sapperton at the Restoration from the Pools, who had held it since the time of Henry VII. His son, the younger Sir Robert, represented Cirencester in the Oxford Parliament of 1681, and was the author of the Ancient and Present State of Gloucestershire, to which we have referred more than once. He died in 1711, the year before his book was published, and is buried in the south transept of the church. There you may behold him in effigy, reclining in a dignified manner on his elbow. He left behind him, says his epitaph, Louise, Lady Atkins, daughter of Sir George Carteret of Horns in Bedfordshire, his most dear and sorrowful widow, who erected this monument to his memory, though he left behind him one more durable, the ancient and present state of Gloucestershire. Another monument presents the figure of a youthful knight, the eldest son of Sir Henry Poole. The church abounds in Jacobean carving, which was removed from the manor house before it was pulled down in 1730 by Lord Bathurst, to whom Sapperton was sold by the heirs of the last Sir Robert Atkins. All this carved oak gives the church quite a character of its own, and harmonizes excellently with the style of architecture. At the same time, there is no mistaking its origin. The massive communion table, for example, has a lower shelf irresistibly suggestive of a sideboard, while the classic termini which ornament the bench ends and the front of the gallery were plainly designed for a very different scene. But the whole effect is fraught with a peculiar charm, which is further enhanced by the strongly built waggon roof of the nave, and the exquisite pale green transparent glass of the windows, which has only in one instance been displaced to make room for the vulgar abomination known as cathedral glass. The churchyard contains the base and shaft of a 15th century cross, another of those many crosses we have found all over the Cotswolds, which mark a stopping point during the pilgrimages in medieval times. It also contains a number of 18th century carved chest tombs and headstones, and plainer tombs of the 18th and 19th centuries, with copper inscription plates, including some signed by Cook of Stroud, Ursel of Cirencester, Isles of Minchinhampton, and Freebury of Stroud. The churchyard was closed for burials in the 1940s. St Kenelm, to whom this church is dedicated, and who has 7 other churches in England bearing his name, was the boy king of Mercia. Some of you may remember when we visited Winchcombe, we told the story of how in 819, when he was but 7 years old and succeeded to the throne, his older sister, Gwendria, supposedly wanting the throne for herself, is said to have persuaded Kenelm's guardian, Ascobert, with hints that he might share the throne with her, to take the boy into the forest, murder him, and bury him in an unmarked grave. This Ascobert supposedly did, enabling Gwendria to observe brightly that her little brother seemed to have disappeared. The plotters, however, were soon undone. Miraculously, a dove flew to Rome, bearing a scroll telling the Pope where Kenelm's body could be found. After a long delay whilst a translator was found to decipher the scroll, there weren't many English speakers in Rome in those days, the Pope apparently responded, and Kenelm's faithful subjects recovered the body and bore it home to Winchcombe Abbey. On the journey, wherever the body was set down, a clear spring of healing water materialized, a prelude to many other miracles. As for Gwendria, her eyes fell out onto her psalter while she was reciting a curse against her little brother as he was carried through the streets of Winchcombe, and she died soon afterwards. Although actually, she didn't. I don't mean to be a spoilsport, but the hard fact is that about the very time she is represented as suffering condign punishment for her misdeeds, Gwynfrith, as she herself spelled her name, was actually making atonement to Wulfrid, Archbishop of Canterbury, for the wrongs her father, King Kenelm, had done to him. At a council held in 825, she handed over to the sea certain lands in lieu of others which Kenelm had forcibly wrested from the Archbishop. A modern window in my old school church at Harrow depicts her in the act of reverently handing over the title deeds. Evans tells us that she subsequently held the position of abbess in more than one convent, and presumably therefore ended her days in the odour of sanctity. Such is the vulnerability of reputations. Evans also tells us about the Canal tunnel that starts just below the village. On this beautiful but wet underfoot spring day, I ruthlessly sent Ross to explore the steep and slippery lanes to find the canal. He tells me he succeeded, so hopefully you're looking at images of it now. The tunnel is still derelict, but there is serious effort afoot to restore it soon. This is what Evans wrote in 1905. From the churchyard, which commands a lovely view down the valley, we descend to Daneway. On our way we pass the mouth of the tunnel that carries the Thames and Severn Canal through the watershed, which separates the basins of the two rivers. The tunnel is nearly 2.5 miles in length. The whole length of the canal from Stroud to Lechlade, where it joins the Thames, being over 30 miles. It was opened in 1792 and was then looked upon as a colossal undertaking and a tremendous triumph of engineering skill. The idea had been ventilated in the reign of Charles II, and it had afterwards been one of Lord Bathurst's visionary schemes. No one can visit Cirencester without becoming familiar with this enthusiastic and hospitable lord, the creator of its famous park and the intimate friend and correspondent of the Pope. I hope you've enjoyed our little spin around Sapperton. This has been a real eye-opener for us. We weren't kind of expecting the extraordinary idyllic beauty of this place. And of course the addition of the canal at the bottom of the valley, the remarkable church with its carving and its remarkable monuments. It's been enormous fun. Leaving this extraordinary village of Sapperton, we're now heading for Pitchcombe, which is southeast of here, about 10 miles. Should take us around about 20 minutes to get there. Now, this is mentioned in Evan's book, very, very briefly. He simply says, "On our way down the valley to Stroud, it may be worthwhile to turn aside for a few minutes to see the pretty village of Pitchcombe, which lies in a hollow close to the road, but so effectually concealed from it that were it not for the finger post, its existence would never be suspected." Getting here, we discover that he's exactly right. It's such a beautiful place. I mean, you really have to come here in ones and twos because it's difficult to get to. You certainly wouldn't find a bus here, but it's definitely worth a visit. We're going to show you around. Come with me. Not surprisingly, in view of its remoteness, the steepness of its little lanes, and the fact that even now, as Evans noted in 1905, without the finger post you would never know it was there, Pitchcombe is a sleepy little place. There are a few staggeringly beautiful valleys running up from the town of Stroud, including the Slad Valley, famously immortalised in Laurie Lee's magical book Cider with Rosie, of which the valley rising to Painswick is one. There is something about how the little hamlets hang on the edge of the hills, usually bisected by fast-rushing streams, looking across the valley, so close you feel you can almost reach out and touch the sleepy farms and grazing livestock on the other side. They don't really change much either. In 1881, Pitchcombe had 40 houses and a population of 216. In 2011, there were 232 people, admittedly living in 105 households. That is not to say, however, that they aren't constantly under threat. Some of you will remember our story of the development threat to the Slad Valley, fended off by determined resistance from the residents. Well, this valley has also had its share of Philistine threats from the Stroud District Council and their local plan. The parish fought off the suggested massive housing developments in the valley, and the latest draft plan has finally dropped any suggestion of the vandalism that would entail. The church, dedicated to St. John the Baptist, is a comparatively modern building, designed and built by William Franklin in 1819. It replaced an earlier church in an unusual way. It was built over the top of the existing building, which was then demolished from the inside. I can only imagine that it was felt to be unthinkable that the village should be without a place of worship, even for the time it took to build the church. In true Franklin fashion, it is a church with many differing styles. Pevsner describes it like this: a symmetrical west facade with a rather haggard west tower with oversized clasping buttresses and minimal battlements, embraced by sacristy and baptistry with perpendicular windows, a broad nave with windows with decorated reticulated tracery. There's a 19th century font and a pulpit designed by Medland and some excellent stained glass. The east window was made in 1870 by Heath, Butler and Bain, and the west window, in the 1870s, by Clayton and Bell. The others were all made by the former in the 1880s and 90s. There are some great monuments inside the church, but it's in the graveyard that some really terrific tombs are to be found. The oldest, just south of the nave, stemmed from 1656, and the wonderful group of table tombs just south of the chancel, mostly to 18th century members of the Palling family, have all the hallmarks of the Painswick School of Masons. Lyre consoled ends, pedestal tombs with rounded corners, and a tea caddy of 1819 with bracket scrolls. The small building on the edge of the graveyard did great service as a Sunday school for many years, but now serves as an excellent village hall. Pitchcombe Mill, with its huge mill pond and a long wing straddling the mill stream, is early 17th century with 18th century additions. It's a classic example of the woolen mills of the area. Pitchcombe House, on the bend in the road at the bottom of the hill, was built in the 1740s for Thomas, the head of the above-mentioned Palling family. They were an important family in these parts. His brother William built another substantial house on the other side of the valley, called Brownshill Court. The present owners are direct descendants of Thomas Palling's nephew, John Carruthers, who inherited the house from his uncle. The splendid village website admits to the settlement having something of a dubious start to life. The first mention of the name seems to be in a letter from the abbot of St. Peter's Monastery in Gloucester, Gilbert Folliot, complaining to the Bishop of Salisbury about the criminal activities of one Walter of Pitchcombe, spelled C-U-M. With the usual variations over time, the name seems to have settled for the last 200 years on Pitchcombe, spelled C-O-M-B-E. Ross and I came away from this lovely place fully aware that we had been lucky enough on a brilliant spring day to be in an absolutely classic Cotswold gem. I hope you've enjoyed our little spin around Pitchcombe. I hope we've managed to portray some of the extraordinary beauty of this place and the kind of loneliness and excitement of it all. We're heading north now, out of Pitchcombe, to Barton on the Heath. It's 38 miles away. It's going to take us an hour, but we're looking forward to the visit. It's a tiny place. From its name, you might expect it to be a bit windswept. Sometimes the villages on the tops of the hills in the Cotswolds are less hospitable than the ones in the valleys. This place does not feel like that. It's wonderful and peaceful. I'm almost speaking in a hushed voice because this place is just people's homes. It's wonderful. We're going to show you around. Come with me. The absence of people in the street, even in the gardens on this lovely spring day, suggests that most of the population of this little hamlet work elsewhere. That shouldn't surprise us. Barton on the Heath grew up around a substantial 18th century red brick rectory, easily visible from the village green, and a lovely late 16th century manor house, and of course the estates that went along with them. Probably all the working population of the village was involved in the local agriculture, whether that be arable or stock farming, or more likely both. These days, farming requires virtually no workforce, so inevitably the residents of the villages like this are either retired, working from home, or commute elsewhere for a living. The manor house, views of which can be gained from the village green as well as from the churchyard, is said to have been altered and restored in the early 17th century by Inigo Jones, the father of modern architecture in England and Wales, and the first to introduce the classical architecture of Rome and the Italian Renaissance to Britain. The house is laid out in the late Tudor style, with an east-west facing central building with wings on either end projecting westwards. There is little in this village to surprise us, really. It's true that it's particularly well cared for. There are no visible signs of decay or neglect, of which even in the most celebrated of communities you usually see a little. But in its historical residence there lies an interesting tale. Some of you will remember our mentioning whilst travelling the towns and villages of the western escarpment of the Cotswolds, the Cotswold Olympics. Games of a strange and unique kind, which have taken place on and off in the hills just outside Painswick since the beginning of the 17th century. They were conceived by an extraordinary lawyer called Robert Dover, who lived in this parish and was celebrated at the time for his remarkable and unusual habit of persuading his clients to compromise and avoid litigation. A later resident was Olivia Wilmot, who spent much of her childhood under the care of her uncle, Dr. James Wilmot, rector of Barton, and was married here in 1791 to J. Serres, from whom she separated in 1804. She achieved some fame as an artist, becoming landscape painter to the Prince of Wales, and more notoriety as claiming to be Princess Olive, daughter of the Duke of Cumberland, a descent less substantial than that of Christopher Sly in the prologue to Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. Aficionados amongst you will remember the prank played on Sly by the local lord, who had the drunken Sly's insensible body carried into his home, so that when he awoke they could persuade him he was himself a lord. Sly says in bewilderment as he woke up, "What? Would you make me mad? Am I not Christopher Sly, old Sly's son of Burton Heath? By birth a pedlar, by education a card-maker, by transmutation a beer-herd, and now by profession a tinker? Ask Miriam Hackett, the fat alewife of Winkert, if she knew me not." The small but beautiful church just south of the manor house is early 12th century in date, with alterations as usual through the centuries. It's dedicated to St. Lawrence, a man celebrated as one of Rome's most important martyrs. He was thought to have been roasted on a gridiron in 258 AD, but it's more likely that he was beheaded in that year, and venerated since the 4th century. On the north wall of the church is a window showing some of the gridiron symbol of St. Lawrence. This was probably moved from the east window above the altar, which was replaced in the early 14th century with what you see today. The small chapel on the south side, attached to the modern porch, was also built in the 14th century, some 100 years after the addition of the simple but beautiful little tower. It's only just over 5 foot square, in 3 stages, each showing signs of repair over the years, and topped by a saddleback roof with stone tiles. It contains 2 bells, dated 1672 and 1740, bearing the names John Kerry and Henry Bagley, respectively. There's a glorious simplicity about this church that stands it a little apart from so many of the more sophisticated buildings we're accustomed to. The 15th century font is octagonal with carved side panels and a plain stem, and the pulpit is again simple in design and probably made up of rescued panelling. There's a holy water stoop, well preserved, and several examples of primitive early carving on the stone arches. One in particular is thought by some to represent a pig, whilst others insist it's a hare. On the village green, there is a well house erected by the Bird family as a monument to R.W.M. Bird. There is speculation that it's modelled on, or perhaps a re-erection of, a late 17th or early 18th century well house, and it carries 2 inscriptions on the drum supporting the urn. This fountain is presented to the parish of Barton on the Heath by Major and Mrs. R.W. Bird in memory of their eldest son, R.W.M. Bird, who died at Barton House on the 12th of July 1874. Loved in life, he lives in loving memory when dead. And around the lion's head spout to the drinking trough is inscribed, "Whosoever will let him take the water of life freely." A quote from Revelations chapter 22, verse 17. Owing to the weathering, the 2 original inscriptions are no longer visible, and 2 matching stone plaques have been fitted to the vertical faces of the plinth, either side of the drinking trough, replicating the inscriptions. They were put there in 2007. It's a lovely, peaceful place to sit in the shade, under the oak tree that's the only survivor of several planted at the same time as the construction of the memorial. But don't let the inevitable sense of tranquility dissuade you from wandering this little village, looking at the delightful cottages with extremely little of the 21st century to spoil your pleasure. And look at the interesting 3-dimensional aerial view of the village, sculpted in clay by presumably local artist Liz Cayley, to celebrate the turn of the millennium, and attached to what we assume was once the local school building. This village has been an absolute joy. I hope you've enjoyed our little tour around this sleepy place of Barton on the Heath. It's absolutely classic Cotswolds. We've had a lovely time here. It's very quiet. It's an absolute perfect classic hidden gem. We're heading now just 2 miles down the road to a place called Little Compton. This is hidden away in one of those folds in the Cotswold Hills. It's the classic Cotswold gem. The manor house here has a fascinating history. We're going to tell you all about it, and we're going to show you around. Come with me. When Evans cycled past here in 1905, he mentioned it only in passing as the village where Bishop, afterwards Archbishop Juxon, had a manor, to which he retired during the Commonwealth. William Juxon, born in 1582, was an English churchman, Bishop of London from 1633 to 1646, and Archbishop of Canterbury after the restoration of the monarchy from 1660 until his death in June 63. He was a firm favourite of Charles I, who in 1636 entrusted Juxon with important secular duties, making him Lord High Treasurer of England as well as First Lord of the Admiralty. For the next 5 years he had to deal with many difficulties on behalf of the king. He resigned the treasurership in May 1641, and during the Civil War the bishop, against whom no charges were ever brought in Parliament, lived undisturbed at Fulham Palace. His advice was often sought by the king, who had a very high opinion of him, and eventually the king selected Juxon to be with him on the scaffold and to deliver him the last rites before his execution. After the king's death, Juxon retired here to concentrate on his favourite sport of hunting. His pack became extremely well known in the area. Not all his neighbours were particularly keen on his presence. There's a story that some of the more Puritan amongst them were keen to find reason to report him to Cromwell to stir up trouble. On one occasion, Juxon's hounds ran straight through Chipping Norton churchyard during a time of public worship, providing a perfect opportunity to lodge a complaint. Cromwell is said to have responded, "Pray, do you think that the bishop prevailed on the hare to run through the churchyard at that time?" The messenger said, "No, and please your highness, I did not directly say he did, but through the holy ground the hare did go at that time." Cromwell dismissed him. "Get you gone, and let me hear no such frivolous complaints. While the bishop continues not to give my government any offence, let him enjoy his diversion of hunting unmolested." In 1660, Juxon was restored to the bishopric of London and almost immediately appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Today, the house is in fantastic condition owing to the fact that it belongs to Sir Alec Reed, founder of the employment agency that bears his name. He originally intended to run it as a farm, but in a very short time decided to use it to house the Reed Business School, where his team not only trains his own company's staff, but also a wide variety of students from elsewhere in financial and management matters. I get the strong impression that quite a lot of this village now belongs to the Reed School, and that students are probably housed in many of the local cottages. The church, dedicated to St. Denis, which sadly today we were unable to access, has several things of interest should you be luckier than we were. We tried asking the school reception for a key, by the way, and they don't hold one, so if you do find it closed, that won't be a successful solution. In the south aisle, there's a stained glass window with 4 scenes depicting Juxon's role at the King's execution. Commissioned in the 1920s by Mrs. Leverton Harris, the owner of the manor at the time, the window was made by Hugh Easton. In the southeast window of the chancel are reset some fragments of 16th and 17th century coloured glass brought from a church at Villers that was destroyed by the Germans in 1918. The tower contains 5 bells by Ruddle, dated 1720, and the little rounded font is an unusual dumpy shape, only 29 inches high and 34 inches in diameter. The village boasts 19 listed buildings, and if you wander the lanes you will be well rewarded. The view of the manor from the main Oakham Road is particularly spectacular and not to be missed, but the house and church are so close together that even though you can't get into the manor grounds, you really do feel you've had a very close look at it from the churchyard. I hope you've enjoyed our little spin around Little Compton. It's a pity we couldn't get into the church. I think I've discovered the reason why. I think they're closed because they've got some birds nesting in the porch. And quite understandably, they don't want people like me coming along and letting the birds inside the church. That's a shame, but it's no less wonderful, this little place. And it demonstrates one of the ways in which these great houses and great little villages can be maintained, the presence of this extraordinary business. Just 3 miles away is the long version of this village. It's called Long Compton, and that's where we're going next. This is a beautiful classic Cotswold village. One of the features, as with so many villages with the word long at the beginning of their name, is that it's on a main road that stretches the village right through and makes rather a lot of noise. You'll find quite a fair bit of traffic here. The village has some rather exciting witchcraft associations, and I'm really looking forward to telling you those stories. So come with me and I'll show you around. Stretching around 3/4 of a mile along the A3400, the road that runs between Shipston-on-Stour and Chipping Norton, Long Compton is an ancient village. There are signs of Roman and even earlier remains locally, but it was in Saxon times that the village was founded, originally just west of today's church, in the field in which the bumps and dips in the ground betrayed the historical presence of buildings. Much repeated local legend tells us that St. Augustine, the patron saint of brewers, printers and theologians, whose thoughts profoundly influenced the medieval worldview and whose writings were one of the theological foundations of the Protestant Reformation, visited Long Compton in the 6th century. I'd always thought he died in 430, so how reliable the legend is I'll leave to you to decide. Our last visit here was from a distance. Some of you may remember we told the story of the Rollright Stones, ancient monuments on the hill above Long Compton. There, it is told, a marauding king and his soldiers were turned to stone by a witch who tricked the king into thinking he was closer to Long Compton than he actually was. Witchcraft seems to have been something of an obsession for the villagers of Long Compton. It was said there are enough witches in Long Compton to draw a load of hay up Long Compton Hill. We're not quite sure how many witches that means they had, but in one case at least, this obsession led to a tragic and violent event. One evening in September 1875, an unfortunate 79-year-old woman called Anne Tennant was walking home with her husband John when she was spotted by a 44-year-old local farm worker called James Hayward. Hayward had had a lousy day, working alone in the fields, and was in a very bad mood. He was mulling over the message his parents had drummed into his head since childhood, that any sort of misfortune in his life was the fault not of his obvious lack of life skills, but of witchcraft. Spotting old Mrs. Tennant, without warning, he attacked her, stabbing her in the legs and arms with his pitchfork and beating her over the head with its handle. Her screams were overheard by a local farmer who came to her rescue, holding Hayward down until the local constable arrived with a doctor. Sadly, Anne Tennant died before the doctor could work his magic. At Hayward's trial, it was reported that the prisoner entertained most astounding delusions and superstitions respecting witches and witchcraft, which had haunted him for years, impelling him to murder the deceased. Hayward was taken to prison in Shipston-on-Stour, where he showed no sign of remorse. He said, "I hope she's dead. She was an old witch. There are 15 more in the village. I'll serve the same. I mean to kill 'em all." James was found to be not guilty by reason of insanity and was ordered to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. Anne Tennant is buried in the Long Compton churchyard. The beautiful thatched lich gate through which you enter said churchyard dates from the early 17th century, and until around 1920 was part of a row of cottages. The village went through a very difficult time during the decline in agriculture in the early 20th century, when many of the village cottages went to rack and ruin. This little remnant of those times was restored and given to the church in 1964. The church of St. Peter and St. Paul is itself largely 13th century and amply rewards the efforts of the visitor. Early in the 14th century, the north aisle was added and a considerable restoration took place. The south porch, through which you enter, is probably late 14th century and contains a 14th century tomb with a very badly worn effigy of a lady. You can see traces of the reticulated side hair coiffure and flat cap of the early 15th century on the head that rests on a cushion. Her dress appears to have been a close-fitting bodice and loose flowing skirt, and her hands were in prayer on her breast, with her feet resting on a dog. Above the figure are the remnants of a canopy. Once inside the church, you're immediately aware of extremely recent alterations to the west end of the church, providing a new meeting room and domestic facilities which, after an initial gulp from an old traditionalist like me, clearly demonstrates a welcome commitment to the future of the church. The furniture in the church, including the font, is all modern. Not as modern as the West End, but not ancient. The pulpit is 19th century, using panels from an earlier 15th century font. The east window over the altar is dating 1862, but set in a 14th century frame. And the chancel carpet was made in 1959 by local village ladies. As your eyes are drawn upwards to the light from the spectacular clerestory raised in the 15th century, you'll notice the carved corbels supporting the trusses of the new roof. They are numerous and detailed, and at the risk of getting a crick in your neck, well worth a careful look. The overall impression is of a busy and much-loved parish church, with lots to please the spirit. There's just one thing, for me, that's difficult to come to terms with. a clumsy wooden cabinet, hexagonal in shape, built in 2004 to commemorate a late church warden, has been placed randomly by the font, destroying any sense of proportion to the space around it. When I saw it, I assumed it was on wheels so that you could move it out of the way, but no, it seems to be fixed to the floor. A sad and quite unnecessary error, which, for me, tips the modern alterations over the line from acceptable to worrying. Hey, but that's just me. Wandering out of the church and down the road a bit, going south, you'll see the old rectory on the left, an interesting building, shows the style in which the clerics of old used to live. And on the right, the village shop, busy and obviously an essential component of this successful community. Otherwise, the village is made up of a collection of old and new cottages of the Cotswold type that overall make a classic and beautiful settlement. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Long Compton. It's amazing what's happened here in the past, and it's really quite spooky thinking of what's taken place. We've enjoyed ourselves. The church is lovely. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can find us on all the normal platforms. Find our website where you'll find all the stuff that we've done in the past. And we look forward to seeing you very soon somewhere else in the Cotswolds.